minister. Now, before we get into some of the details of Isaiah, let me give a little bit of Old Testament context. This goes all the way back to Exodus. It goes back to Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, all the way back in Israel's very early history when they're in Egypt. God warned them, he warned the nation all the way back then not to follow other gods and not to worship the gods of the land that you go in to possess. In fact, he says in chapter 34 of Exodus, he says, be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they're going to invite you and they're going to, hey, why don't you come over and eat this hamburger sacrificed to Baal? He says, but when you choose some of their daughters and wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same, to not make any idols. So again, it's written about, again, not just here in Exodus 34, but also read Deuteronomy 28. In Old Testament scholarship, this is called the Deuteronomic principle, the blessings and curses. I will bless you if you follow my word and my law, my Torah, but if you disobey me, you worship other gods, I will drive you out of the land. So this is a warning. And so by the time we come to the book of Isaiah, Israel is a divided kingdom. Divided after the death of Solomon, the kingdom was split into the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital was in Samaria, and the southern kingdom was centered around Jerusalem there in the north. Now, if you look at there on where it says the Philistine city-states, this is where some of the Assyrians were, and we'll talk about this here in a moment. The Assyrians had invaded just to the south, and they occupied the Gaza Strip all the way down to the southern part of Israel along the coastal area there where the Philistines were. So again, by the time of Isaiah, Israel and Judah were bitter enemies in the 8th century. They hated each other. In fact, so much so that Israel had made an alliance with Syria and Damascus to march against Jerusalem. So Jerusalem had become, but Jerusalem itself had become rife with wickedness, idolatry, and injustice toward the poor. Just read Isaiah 1, again, where Isaiah the prophet calls them rulers of Sodom. Then Isaiah 46, he mocks the fact that they make idols made out of wood, made out of stone, made out of gold. They can't do anything. They have no life in them. So they were warned back in the Old Testament, back in Exodus, back in Deuteronomy, not to make. And there they are making the same things. And Israel is further down the road. And Isaiah saying, basically, here's my paraphrase of this going on. He's saying, basically, you see what's happening to Israel? Well, that's what's going to happen to us if we don't repent. So Isaiah is the context of that episode in which there were conspiracy theories that were abounding. And they came to a point to where Judah had to trust God or trust the armies of Assyria for help. So that's the whole context of the Isaiah 7. Again, to kind of go back to show you some of the gods that were present in the land all the way back to the time of Joshua and the Israelites. You got the Canaanite gods, the Canaanite pantheon, Baal, Yam, the god of the sea, El and his Asherah, that may strike a memory chord with you. Catharwa Cassis, the god of crafts, Mot, the god of the underworld, and Anath, the sister of Baal. Asherah is in the ancient world considered to be, it could be a proper name of a goddess. It could also be a particular kind of goddess, a category of goddess, like a fertility goddess. And we read, of course, all throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites did what was offensive to Yahweh. They ignored God. They worshiped the Baalim, the plural of Baal, and the Asherot. So they worshiped these gods, and they were basically, God was getting ready to judge them and drive them out of the land. So in 1 Kings 18:19, the famous episode of Elijah summoning the 400 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah there on Mount Carmel. And we, of course, we see, interestingly, this great battle that takes place. Well, it's not a great battle. It's really not a fight at all, because God is the one who answers by fire. The true God will answer by fire, and he did. And what the ironic thing about that, and the polemical angle of that, is that Baal was the god of thunder and lightning, but yet he wasn't the god of thunder and lightning. It was Yahweh, the god of thunder and light. So anyway, really cool thing. 2 Kings 34, Asherah is associated with Baal. You get the idea. The point I'm trying to make here is that by the time of the prophet Isaiah, Israel had already basically bought lock, stock, barrel into worshiping Baal and Asherah, and there were kings that tried to institute reforms, but to no avail. We find the archaeological record is replete with evidence of Baal and Asherah. This was found in northern Israel at a place called Khirbet Kabarsa. This is a mold of Asherah. Very likely, this bronze little statuette was likely placed on a wooden staff, and this is what we know known as the Asherah pole or the Asherah staff. But it's a fertility figurine, and they would bow down and they worship these. And Judges tells us in Judges 3:7. This is a Baal statue from a place called Ugarit, and it's in the Louvre in Paris. Here in Chicago, there is they have artifacts from the site of Megiddo in northern Israel. This is a statue of Baal, and he sort of looks like a 1950s jazz musician here, but with that little beard he's got going on there. And this is another statue, Baal statue, found in Tel Megiddo here in Chicago, and he's got his hand upraised, very likely with the mace that the gods gave him to overcome Mot in the underworld as he fought to come back to life in the resurrection. And that's the whole Baal cycle. In Jerusalem, the very same time that Isaiah is preaching and writing, we found these fertility figurines. So this is Jerusalem in the 8th century BC, Lakish also. All these fertility figurines were discovered there in Jerusalem. More fertility figurines, Asherah and Astarte. So the archaeology is affirming exactly what the text is saying. The text, Isaiah is saying that they are worshiping other gods. They're not trusting God. They're worshiping Asherah. They're worshiping these other gods. And so this brings us to what I believe is really a sort of an archetype of basically a miniature version of the entire book of Isaiah in this whole episode of when Ahaz gets word that the northern kingdom had made an alliance with Syria. And so we read this in Isaiah 7:1. This is the context of the Messiah passage. And it says, and now it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to make war against it, but could not prevail against it. And it was told to the house of David, saying, Syria's forces are deployed in Ephraim. And then the text says, so his heart and the heart of his people were moved as the trees of the woods are moved with the wind. So they were terrified by this alliance. So basically, it would be sort of like in America, if we got word, not that this is going to happen, but if we got word that Canada had made an alliance with Russia and that they were going to invade America and that they were building their forces up across the border in Canada, and they were going to invade America and overthrow Washington and put their own king on the throne or on the platform in Washington. It's sort of the same thing. So they were afraid, and it was an opportunity for them to trust the Lord. This is because, again, this is Judah we're talking about now. Ahaz was a son of David. He was a descendant of King David, who was the king that God had made a covenant with in 2 Samuel chapter 7. God made a covenant with David that he's going to establish his throne forever because David was a man who trusted the Lord. And so Isaiah interacts with him and says this. He says, goes and he says, listen, Ahaz, thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, nor it shall come to pass, for the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be broken, so that it will not be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria. The head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. And then Isaiah says to him, if you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. So the prophet Isaiah is trying to get across to Ahaz that, listen, I understand that you got this word that there's this conspiracy that this is going to happen, but don't worry about it. You need to trust in me and believe that I will protect Judah. But of course, what does he do? He basically offers Ahaz, get this now, he offers Ahaz this deal. Can you imagine if you had a prophet of God who offered you this amazing little thing here? He says, okay, Here's the thing, Ahaz, you just ask God for a sign that the Lord your God is going to be with you, whether ask it in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz says, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Then he said, Isaiah, hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing? Sorry about all these misspellings. It's a mall thing. It's a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Immanuel, which means God with us. So this prophecy in Isaiah 7 is a prophecy that applied to that time in the 8th century. But this is a good place to introduce you to a concept in hermeneutics, especially when you come to prophecy, predictive prophecy, and even prophecy, not just in Isaiah, but other passages as well. It's called the law of double fulfillment. So many prophets were writing to their generation, and they were writing about things that were going to happen in their generation. And there was an application to the people to who he was addressing, specifically to Ahaz, but it had an ultimate fulfillment in Christ. So there was a virgin that they all knew, and that child was going to be a child that God has not forgotten the covenant that he's going to protect Judah and Israel. So God himself, this was an act of grace on God. Ahaz, not only was he not trusting God, under the table, he was playing footsie with Tiglath-Pileser III and giving him money to protect them from this alliance. So I'm going to jump to the chase here. In 738 BC, during the reign of King Menem of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser occupied Philistia, or modern southwestern Israel and the Gaza Strip, the map we just looked at earlier, and he invaded Israel. He invaded the northern kingdom, imposing a heavy tribute. Ahaz, king of Judah, engaged in a war against Israel at Aramea. He appealed to help to the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser by gifts of gold and silver. See Isaiah 7 and 9. So it's also in Kings as well, and Chronicles. Instead of trusting God, Ahaz tried to buy off his protection to this king of Assyria, which he did. Tiglath-Pileser accordingly marched against Damascus, defeated and put Rezin to death, and besieged the city itself, leaving part of the army to continue the siege. He advanced, ravaging with fire and sword to the provinces east of the Jordan, Nabatea, Moab, Edom, Philistia, and Samaria. And this is exactly what Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 8, that he's saying basically, listen, and I'm paraphrasing this, listen, Ahaz, when you pay off the Assyrians, they're going to take care of your enemies for you. They're going to take care of the northern kingdom, which you shouldn't be raising an army against your brothers anyway. But when you do this, it's not just that they're going to overcome the northern kingdoms, but they're going to flood. Read Isaiah chapter 8. God is going to bring in the flood of Assyria, and it's going to overflow the banks, and it's going to overflow even into Judea itself and even Jerusalem. And that's exactly what happened. So in 732 BC, he took the chief Aramean state of Damascus, deporting many of its inhabitants and Israelite inhabitants of Samaria to Assyria, written about in 2 Kings 16, Isaiah 7 and 8. This is a good place to bring up we've talked about them, I just mentioned them, the Assyrians, and we technically call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And this is during the time of Isaiah, they were approaching the height of their power politically. And you can see there in this map, the political extent of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, running all the way from southern Iraq, all the way up through the Fertile Crescent, up into Syria, all the way down into the Levant or Israel, and along the coast of Israel, all the way down into Egypt. So this was a very, very powerful state, and they were experts in siege warfare. In fact, every spring, they would actually go out to make war. And this is the extent of their power. So this is the time. This little slide here is just an overview, just so you can sort of see a bird's eye view of the Neo-Assyrian kings. The first Assyrian king was a king by the name of Adad-Nirari. So the Neo-Assyrian kings ranged from about 911 to about 662 BC, ending with a very famous Assyrian monarch, king, ruler by the name of Ashurbanipal, whose royal library at Nineveh was excavated in 1849, and a huge cache of cuneiform tablets were discovered that contain the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the yellow kings that are highlighted there all have references in the Old Testament. In fact, Shalmaneser III, there is a obelisk that actually contains two kings of Israel bowing down, paying tribute to the king Shalmaneser III, King Jehu and King Omri. I think I may have a slide of this. I'm not sure. It's recorded in 1 Kings chapter 16, 2 Kings 8, 2 Chronicles 22. And then, of course, jumping all the way down to Shalmaneser V, King Hoshea, Sargon II, also known as Tartanu in the Old Testament, whose capital was at a place called Corsabod, we'll talk about in a moment. And then Sennacherib, which figures largely into the book of Isaiah, Hezekiah, his capital was at Nineveh, Esarhaddon, written about in Isaiah 20. In fact, Assyria was probably at its greatest power under Esarhaddon. And then the last king of Assyria was Ashurbanipal, who we talk about here in a moment. So, so this is. Let me why I'm mentioning. So that's the Assyrian kings. After the Assyrian kings, in fact, in the court of Ashurbanipal was a actual Babylonian, a Neo-Babylonian to be specific. His name was Nabopolassar. He was an official in the Neo-Assyrian court of Ashurbanipal. He was the first ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And so he destroyed Nineveh and defeated it in 612 BC with the help of his son, and yes, you know him, Nebuchadnezzar II. So Nabopolassar is the first king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and his son was co-regent with him for a while until his father died in battle. The kingdom of Judah was taken into captivity under Nebuchadnezzar II. And by the way, while we're at it, in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah actually predicts toward the end of the book the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In fact, addresses the fact that Israel or Judah was very likely going to go into captivity. Of course, Jeremiah writes about this extensively in the book of Jeremiah. Nabonidus is the last king. We have not the last king. Next to the last king, you have the Nabonidus Chronicle, the cylinder of Nabonidus, corresponding to the Old Testament. There are some passages in the Old Testament that match these archaeological findings. And then Belshazzar, the eldest son of Nabonidus, co-reigned with his father, was very likely killed when Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians in 539 BC. The reference there is in Daniel chapter 5, verses 7 and 1. So just to kind of give you some context of where this fits in. So at the time of this whole episode with Ahaz and Hezekiah, or Ahaz first, Ahaz worried about this alliance by this king. You've got basically carrying them off into captivity, Tiglath-Pileser, and then eventually Sargon II, carrying them off into captivity. And Sargon actually went to the north and built his capital at a place called Corsabod. You can see there right by the arrow. So there were two capitals. The old capital of the Assyrian Empire, the old Assyrian Empire and the Neo-Assyrian Empire, was Nineveh for millennia, for many, or for centuries rather. And then for just during the reign of Sargon II, the capital was at Corsabod. Both sites have been excavated, and both sites actually confirm events in the Old Testament. So let's first talk about Corsabod, or it's another name for it is called Dur-Sharrukin. It was the palace fortress of Sargon II, first studied by a French consul general at Mosul, Iraq in 1842, Paul-Émile Boda. First recognized this. He wasn't an archaeologist, but he first studied the ruins there in Iraq. And then in 1847, a British diplomat by the name of Austin Henry Layard explored the ruins of Corsabod. Corsabod was excavated by the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago from 1928 to 1935 under Edward Chiera. When they OI excavated there, they excavated a massive 40-ton human-headed winged bull called a Lamassu, a mythical creature, from the throne room, the entrance to the throne room, and they brought this thing back to Chicago, where it was placed in the Oriental Institute Museum. And so this is a photograph of the archaeologist. This is based on the excavation reports and of the extensive excavations at Corsabod. And you can see there right there in the throne room. The finger's pointing to it. What we're gonna see next are artifacts from the throne room. Now, how does this all fit into Isaiah? Well, this is Sargon II, whose palace was built by the gold that the Assyrians took from the northern kingdom in Israel. They not only from the gold and the money that they took and the wealth that they acquired from the northern kingdom of Israel and Ephraim, but also the slave labor as well. And so this is an artist rendition of what the royal court of Corsabod would look like. And you can see there the Lamassu. And this is the actual Lamassu at the Oriental Institute and here in Chicago. And to the left there, you can see these are huge panels that were actually in the inner court. Now, the one Lamassu, this thing weighs 40 tons, 40 tons. So it's quite heavy. And they had to cut it in several pieces to actually get it in the building. And it's been there for over 100 years now. I think it was brought in 1911, but I'm not positive. I have to go back and look at the date. These panels are actually show there on the right. You can see sort of face is sort of worn off. You can see the face of Sargon II. And this is a wedding party. The other side of this is actually in the Iraqi Museum in Iraq today. And I think it's in Baghdad. This one is in Chicago at the Oriental Institute Museum. Now, what I want to show you is on the other side, as you enter into the inner sanctuary of the throne room of Sargon II, there is this train of court officials in the court of Sargon II. And the guy on the left is the guy that we just read about, or that we're going to read about here in a moment. I don't know if we read about him yet, but we're going to read about him in a moment. That is none other than Sennacherib. And Sennacherib was the crown prince and the son of Sargon II. And you can see him there on the left. And it's a really good picture. You can see close-up view. And of course, if you're here in Chicago, I actually lead trips to the OI, and I actually had good old Sennacherib to pat me on the head. So, it's nice to have an Assyrian king pat you on the head. I know that's kind of corny, but anyway. So let me go back here to Sennacherib. We're going to come back to this in a moment, but so the significance of this is that this palace was built by the gold and all of the wealth that was taken from the northern kingdom, taken off into captivity under Tiglath-Pileser, and then his following rulers, ending up with Sargon II. And Sargon, of course, established the capital at Corsabod. Now, when Sargon died, he died in battle, which in Assyria is considered to be a bad omen. So his son, Sennacherib, changed the capital and moved it back to Nineveh. And this is a really amazing painting. I don't know how accurate it is. It's a 19th century painting of what the city of Nineveh may have looked like in its heyday. And it's there on the banks of the Tigris River in northern Iraq. Again, as was Corsabod, Nineveh was first studied by the French consul general at Mosul, Iraq, Paul-Émile Botta in 1842, and then in 1847 by the British diplomat Austin Henry Layard, explored the ruins. In 1849, Layard rediscovered the lost palace of Sennacherib because there's, of course, multiple layers. He found 71 rooms and very large reliefs. In fact, we're going to look at some of those reliefs tonight because those reliefs actually record an event that is recorded in the book of Isaiah. Layard also unearthed the very famous library of Ashurbanipal with 22,000 cuneiform clay tablets. Layard sent most of the material to the British Museum in London. Other artifacts went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which is where they are today. The site was later explored by a modern Assyrian Christian, actually, by the name of Hormuzd Rassam, and then later by the British scholar George Smith. It was George Smith who, working in the British Museum, first recognized and translated some of the cuneiform tablets, specifically tablet 11, which was a part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the tablet 11 was the flood component of the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which it records Gilgamesh going to visit the Babylonian Noah a guy by the name of Utnapishtim. And when Smith read this, he saw the connections with the flood story in the book of Genesis. And so we now know that it's earlier, of course, textually, not earlier in truth. It's a corruption of the flood story, but it is the earliest mention of the flood that we have in some of the historical writings. Quite remarkable. So in the back in chapter 7 and later, we see that after Ahaz died and Hezekiah reigned, and in 2 Kings 18, and of course in Isaiah as well, that we read, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And then Hezekiah sent word to the king of Assyria at Lakish. Now, why Lakish? Again, because the Assyrians were there on the coastal plain just to the south. Lakish guarded the main road leading up to Jerusalem, which was located about 30 miles northeast. I'll show you a map here in a moment. It'll make sense. In 1929, the site called Tel El Duer was identified by William F. Albright as the actual ancient ruins of Lakish. A big excavation was taking place by the British in 1932. And then since then, I don't know if it's been excavated recently, but all the archaeological data so far supports, nobody doubts this is Lakish. So it is written about in the Old Testament, in Kings, in Chronicles, also in the book of Isaiah as well. We'll take a look at some passages there. But I want you to see there on this map on the lower left here, you see Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. These are Philistine states, city-states, but these are Philistine cities there on the coastal plain, and that is where the Assyrians were located. We are actually archaeological evidence of the Assyrian occupation. So why would, when they're invading and they want to go to Jerusalem, which is where the capital of Judah is, so why would they go to Lakish? Well, they're down there in the coastal plain. So they amass their army down there and they go up to Lakish to fight against Lakish, because Lakish guarded, it was a fortified, very fortified city, and it guarded the main road leading to Jerusalem, which is about 30 miles northeast of where Lakish was located. So there is, again, where Lakish is in relationship to Jerusalem. And there it is today. This is what it looks like today. Again, large excavations were started in 1932 by the British, J.L. Starkey, Harding, and Tufnell. You can see there in the ruins are still the bottom part of the revetment, the outer gatehouse, and then the ramp. There was a ramp going up into the city itself. This is actually what it may have looked like in the time of Isaiah, in the time of the 8th century, the outer gatehouse and the ramp. And this is actually latter. The Assyrians destroyed it in 701 BC, and then the Babylonians destroyed it in 586 or 587 BC. But back in 1935, these clay tablets, or clay pieces called ostraka, or ostrakhan rather, or plural of ostraka. Ostraka is a potsherd with writing on it. And so this gives an account of Judah's last days before the last invasion of Lakish. So Lakish was destroyed not only by Sennacherib, but also by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And this little potsherd actually records an officer, a military officer, who's actually calling for help. The letter never got sent, but the archaeologists discovered it years later, and they're in at Lakish. So not only do we have Lakish recorded in the Old Testament, but going back to Nineveh, Nineveh was excavated, and lo and behold, on the walls of Nineveh were, guess what? The entire episode of Sennacherib and his invasion of Judah and this invasion of Lakish are actually recorded on the panels at Nineveh. There are 16 panels long. You can see there, it's sort of maybe hard to see there, but you can see there on the wall on the left-hand side, the defenders of Lakish, the Jewish defenders of Lakish. And I wish I had a better photograph to show you of image of this, but in some of the images, I'll just tell you what they're doing. It's kind of gross. So if the ladies are watching, I'm sorry if you get grossed out by this, but the defenders of Lakish they would pour boiling oil over the side of the wall to try to boil and kill the Assyrian invaders. And the Assyrians were likewise just as brutal to the captives, or those. And in some of the panels, there are actually stacks of heads in which they would behead the Jews outside the city wall, and they would lob the head back over the wall. So it's kind of gross. You can see there the Assyrian archers. This is all at Nineveh, all recorded in Nineveh. You can see there on the left hand, and I'm going to show you a close up, but they actually, not only did they behead them, they also impale them on stakes, the Jews, when they captured them. And this is what it looked like, flaming arrows. You can see there they had siege machines. I mean, it was a very, very well-oiled military machine. The Assyrian army were very, very well-oiled. And the interesting, cool thing about this is that, you can read about mythical stories of a battle. And one of the sort of controversial stories in ancient history is the sacking of Troy by the Greeks. You got the Trojans and the Greeks, and of course the Homer writes about this, and there's still some debate about some of the historical veracity of that. It's not cut and dry. And then of course you can read about in J.R. Tolkien's book Lord of the Rings, in the Two Towers, he writes about this mythical battle that took place, the Battle of Helm's Deep. But there's no historical anything that you can go and find. Of course, it's made up. But the amazing thing about the Old Testament is it records a place called Lakish. Well, they found Lakish. It records a person named Sennacherib. We found Sennacherib. It records a great battle that took place at Lakish. Very, very violent battle. In fact, to this day, there are still Assyrian bronze arrowheads embedded in the stones at Lakish. That's how absolutely violent it was. And 16 panels long. But I want you to see here on the bottom of the screen, look at the middle bottom of that. You can see the bodies that the Assyrians are placing on the stakes. And you can see the missiles, the flaming arrows, and all the great, archers, and all the, it was just pretty deadly battle that took place. And so after the battle, there were captives. And you can see there on this panel, it shows Sennacherib there sitting on his throne. And the captives that they did survive are brought before him. They're bowing down to him. They're bringing him gold. And they're bringing him all these treasures, things like that. And then they're taken off into captivity. And this is all recorded in the palace walls of Nineveh, all recorded in the Old Testament, book of Isaiah, and then we also have it in the palace walls of Nineveh. Not only were they taken off, but going back to the Lamassu, you remember that big giant winged bull that we saw earlier, the thing that weighs 40 tons? The captives also here in Nineveh, they're shown actually pulling a rough carving of one of those Lamassu on a giant sled. So it is possible, folks, that some of the Jewish captives that were taken off into Assyria possibly helped build some of these Lamassus and chisel them with the help of their artisans. So I think that's really pretty interesting in historical connection. So let's go back to the story. So Hezekiah obviously got word, and they knew that the Assyrians were coming. They overtook Lakish. The battle was great, but he knew they were coming, and so he wanted to make preparations. So in Jerusalem, so he knew that as the people at Lakish were defending Lakish and battling the Assyrians, he had to get things ready in Jerusalem. And so in 2 Chronicles 32, when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem, he planned with his officers and his mighty men to stop the water of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. So, and this is also written about in Isaiah 22, which we'll look at here in a second. So what this means is the Assyrian army would surround a city and they would block off the water. And Hezekiah knew this, and he knew that the city had to have water during a siege. So when Hezekiah saw this, he basically said to himself, the only way we can survive this is if we have water. So he stopped up the spring of Siloam, and the water went underground, and they connected the water in this underground tunnel. And in the 1800s, the tunnel was discovered by Edward Robinson, Charles Warren, and other early biblical explorers. And they found an inscription in the tunnel called Hezekiah's Tunnel, or the Siloam Tunnel inscription. Now, Israel at the time was occupied by the Ottoman Empire. So this inscription, which is written in Paleo Hebrew, is actually now in the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, Turkey. Now, when I was there a couple of years ago in Istanbul, I went to the museum, and sadly, this artifact was not on display. It was not available for public viewing. So I was a little miffed at that. But Lord willing, I'm going to go back and I'll get to see this. But it is now in the Istanbul Museum in Istanbul, Turkey. And there is a better picture of it, recorded again in 2 Chronicles 32, and then also in the book of Isaiah. And not only did he build a tunnel to bring water into Jerusalem, but Hezekiah also broadened the wall. So here is where he mentions not only the water, but also broadening the wall of Jerusalem to make it more fortified. So it says, he removed the protection from Judah. You looked in that day to the armor of the house of the forest. In other words, Isaiah is saying that to Hezekiah, listen, you didn't really trust God. You trusted in all this other stuff. You also saw the damage to the city of David, that it was great. You gathered together the waters of the lower pool, the Siloam tunnel. You numbered the houses of Jerusalem and the houses you broke down to fortify the wall. So that Isaiah tells us that as Hezekiah was preparing for this invasion of this Assyrian king, he tore down some of the houses in order to make the wall wider so that the Assyrian army could not break down the wall. You also made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to its maker, nor did you have respect for him who fashioned it long ago. Notice how Isaiah adds that little jab at the end there to Hezekiah for not trusting God. Well, lo and behold, in 1970s, Israeli archaeologist Naaman Abigad, excavating Jerusalem, guess what, folks? He discovered the broad wall of Hezekiah, confirming exactly what Hezekiah or what Isaiah says, that they had to tear down some of the houses in order to make the wall wide so that the Assyrian army could not break through Jerusalem. It was discovered in the Jewish quarter. It's 7 meters wide, or 23 feet wide, and 203 feet long. It's referenced in Isaiah 22, 9 and 10. Also in Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 8. It was still standing when Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile to rebuild the temple. Hezekiah's wall was still standing. So all the archaeological evidence supports that Isaiah 22, that homes had to be destroyed to actually build a wall, because right next to the wall, in fact, the wall runs through some of the dwelling places there in the 8th century in Jerusalem. So once again, and it's not surprising, the archaeology matches exactly what the text actually tells us. So these events are grounded in solid history, but it doesn't stop there. You get more. Here's another angle of the Hezekiah's broad wall that dates to the 8th century BC. So if you go, it's exposed. If you go to Jerusalem, there's a certain place that you can go and view the broad wall. I think you used to be able to walk on it, but now you can't. This is an artist rendition of what it may have looked like in the 8th century BC. And not only do we have the broad wall and we have the palace of Nineveh, we have something called the Sennacherib prism. This is written in cuneiform. 3 are known to exist. One is called the Oriental Institute prism. The other one is called the Taylor prism at the British Museum. And the other one, I don't know what it's called technically, the name for it. Maybe called Jerusalem prism, but it's actually in Jerusalem in the Holy Land Museum in Jerusalem. So we know of 3 copies that are known to exist. And so what Sennacherib did, this is sort of like a billboard, if you will, describing what Sennacherib did in his reign. And what it does is it affirms exactly what we read about in the book of Isaiah when Sennacherib came into Judah, sacked Lakish, took off captives, and then also surrounded Jerusalem. It doesn't say he captured Jerusalem. He did not capture Jerusalem. So this prism here affirms Isaiah 36 and 37, 2 Kings 18, 2 Chronicles 32, and the little phrase there at the bottom right of this prism, this is actually the translation of this. It says literally, this is what it says: as for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. So it does not say that Sennacherib sacked Jerusalem, because he didn't. Because when you read about it in the text, what does Hezekiah do? He prays for protection the protection of God, that God would send some help for Judah. And what does he do? Of course, the Assyrians go and they surround Jerusalem, and he gives them a little bit of gold. Finally, they go away, they come back, and the second time that Sennacherib comes back is when we believe the angel of the Lord went through the camp and killed many of the Assyrians. Not only do we have all of these other things, but just recently, in the past few years, we have discovered, not me, but Elia Mazar, I think her name was, discovered a bulla. This is a clay seal with the name of Hezekiah on it. It dates to the 8th century BC. It was found in the old city of Jerusalem. Not only was the seal of Hezekiah discovered, but folks, we also have the seal of the prophet Isaiah himself discovered with just a few inches from the seal of Hezekiah. So they're together in the archaeological record found in something called the Ophel excavations by the archaeologist Elia Mazar from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, discovered 3 feet from the Hezekiah bulla. And there's no reason to reject this as being the actual seal of the prophet Isaiah. Could have been a signet ring, very likely, and that ring would have been pressed on this clay seal to seal a scroll. So who knows what this seal actually sealed up? Could it have been part of the original book of Isaiah? And notice the translation there. It says belonging to Isaiah Navi, and the Hebrew word Nevaim is the word prophet. So if you ever heard of the Old Testament called the Tanakh, TNK, the Torah, the Nevaim, and the K stands for the prophet, or the law of the prophets and the writings. So the Ketuvim is the writings. The Nevaim is the prophets. So that's where Tanakh comes from. So Isaiah Nevi is Isaiah the prophet. Pretty awesome stuff. And you can see there a little bit a better up close picture of the seal of Isaiah, and you can see there his signature right there in the middle section of the seal. Pretty amazing stuff indeed. So Sennacherib marched toward Jerusalem, destroying 46 towns and villages, including Lakish, destroyed them. It's graphically described in Isaiah 6 and also in the palace walls of Nineveh. Next, what happened is not really clear. The Bible tells us that an angel of the Lord killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers at Jerusalem after Hezekiah prayed in the temple. And Hezekiah, Sennacherib's account says that Judah paid him tribute and he left, which very likely happened. The Hebrew Bible does state that Hezekiah did pay tribute once and that the Assyrians left, but returned a second time, which is very likely when the soldiers were killed. However, what is certain is that Sennacherib failed to actually capture Jerusalem. That's mentioned in 2 Kings 18, and the Oriental Institute Prism records that very event. I think it's appropriate for us to sort of end on one of my favorite poets, one of my favorite romantic poets, Lord Byron, in his poem about Sennacherib. So I'm going to finish with this, and then we have a scripture verse that I want to read you. We started off with reading about in the book of Luke. Byron says this: the Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rolls mightily on deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn is blown, that host on the morrow laid withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings in the blast and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed, and the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved and forever grew still. And the widows of Ashur are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal, and the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. Lord Byron. And this is in his poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib, written in 1815. Pretty cool poem. There's other stanzas that I didn't want to read the whole thing, but I think you get the idea. Isaiah tells us that Jesus was the suffering servant. And Isaiah 53 says, he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. This prophecy was written 700 years before Jesus came on the scene. And if we can trust the book of Isaiah with history, we can trust it with prophecy about the Messiah. I want to end with this note right here. Earlier we read that Jesus, when he was in the temple, the tabernacle rather, at Nazareth, he read in the book of Isaiah chapter 61. But I want you to notice where he stopped, because Jesus came as the suffering servant in Isaiah. He was predicted by the prophet Isaiah very, very clearly. And he was handed the scroll, it says, and he came to the place where it was written, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor and has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Now, what I want you to notice is this. Jesus stops right there. And if you know that passage in Isaiah chapter 61, I want to read you the very next thing that the text says. And Jesus does not read it. And I really think it's significant, because the next thing he's going to say, the next thing the text says is this. It says this. I'm going to read you. It says, he sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison for those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. That's where Jesus stopped. The very next thing it says, and the day of vengeance to our God. Now, what does this all mean? Well, later on in the book of Isaiah, we're going to read about this suffering servant. Not only is he going to suffer and die and come back to life, he's going to come again. And he's going to come back as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so the same prophet that predicted the first coming of Christ also predicts the second coming of Christ. So I think that in our day and age, in which there's a lot of people who are worried about what's happening in the world, I think we can take a lesson from the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, not to worry about the things that are happening. And even though we as Americans, and even as Europeans, we're not Israel. I mean, we were not given the Torah. We're not given the same promise in the covenants that Israel was. But we can trust God, though. And the scripture does tell us, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And I think there's a lesson for us, just like there was a lesson for Ahaz, that when we are faced with opposition, we're faced with a great challenge, even possible destruction, we have the choice to trust God. We have the choice to believe that God is going to protect us. And I think that this lesson here is, even when we decide not to, just like God did with Judah, he had grace on them, not because they deserved it, but because of who he is. He's a God of grace and mercy. So I think it's a great lesson for us. And I hope and pray that you were encouraged by this. And I'm going to be available, by the way. And thank you guys for watching. I know there's a lot to process, and I know we jumped around a lot. And we talked about Assyria. We talked about, Sennacherib and Sargon. There's a lot of names we threw out. So if you're confused about that, let me know. I'll be around. I also check the comments. So if you do have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section. And I'm going to be around later tonight to answer any questions you might have on this. We also want to encourage you to, if you have been blessed by Epic Archaeology, by our videos and by our teaching, I want to ask you if you would become one of our supporters, monthly donor. Any amount that you can give would be great. We really are trying to get monthly supporters, $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever you can give. We would be so grateful for that. It'd be a great blessing to us as we can produce more videos. We've got a lot of things we'd like to do, but we can't because of obviously for money situation. So if you're able to make a donation to Epic Archaeology, we sure appreciate that. It'll be a great blessing to us. Also, I want to encourage you, if you have not done so already, to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you like the video, please hit like and put a comment there in the comment section. This is going to be uploaded later to YouTube. We're probably going to break it up into a couple of 2 different sections so that it's not too long. But subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We're on Instagram as well. But again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will be around later to answer your questions about the book of Isaiah. Again, we're just touching the tip of the iceberg on this. Even preparing for this tonight's lesson, I mean, we're already like an hour and a half into it, and I felt like we didn't even hardly really cover it. I probably missed a lot of things that I should have talked about that I didn't talk about, but wanted to give you just a broad overview of the remarkable historical reliability of the book of Isaiah, and just the fact that he is an amazing prophet that is just to this day still speaks to us. 2,700 years after the fact that he wrote, Isaiah is still as relevant today as it was when it was first written down 2,700 years ago in Judea. So I want to encourage you not only to study the archaeology of Isaiah, but also read the book of Isaiah yourself. Meditate upon it, think about it, listen to what God says to the prophets or through the kings of Israel and Judah, and that we might learn a lesson from it. So again, thank you guys for watching, and I hope and pray that you have a great afternoon, great evening, wherever you are watching, and I will be around later to answer questions. So you guys take care, and God bless.